Hello and welcome to ATG, the podcast, and we're very pleased to be talking today to John Unsworth. John, you've been involved in the teaching of English and digital humanities for much of your long career. Let's start, if we may, with your background in English. So you studied English as your first degree, correct?
Yeah, I got my PhD in English in the late 80s from the University of Virginia.
What was the PhD on?
I wrote a dissertation on contemporary academic postmodern fiction,
Wow.
which was really about its publishing, its reception, the marketplace, and the sort of through line for me of my interests in the things that we'll probably talk about today is scholarly communications. And so the dissertation looked at little magazines and the evolution of the little magazine into academic quarterlies and the role of writers in preparing the reception of their own works when they are contemporary with their critics.
Fascinating. So the remarkable thing about your career is you managed to combine your interest in with the humanities with a career in libraries. So how did you manage that?
Well, it was a process. Excuse me. I didn't really run a library until 2012, when I was appointed to oversee the libraries at Brandeis University. Now, I did spend 9 years before that at the University of Illinois as dean of a library school, but that's a very different job than running a library. If you're dean of a library school, you're helping to educate librarians and running a tenure track faculty and faculty research programs and centers and all that sort of stuff, which is a different job from running a library. So I only started running libraries in 2012, and I've only run two of them, Brandeis and the University of Virginia.
Only two. For most people, one is enough.
Well, many people, it's a profession where, people stay in these jobs for a long time. So it's, my profile is a little unusual, but hardly unprecedented.
So your teaching, you talked about your doctorate being in contemporary literature, and it sounds like your teaching was largely about contemporary literature. In fact, one of your courses was, I believe, 20th century American bestsellers.
Yeah, I started that at the University of Virginia. I taught versions of that course at Illinois and at Brandeis, and then back at UVA again. It resulted in a database that is still online at bestsellers.library.virginia.edu, where there are about 350 entries on books that were top 10 annual bestsellers in some year of the 20th century, or years in some cases, more than one. And those are books that students chose from the list of 20th century top 10s, and then did a series of assignments which were submitted as database entries. And that's what you find. If you go to that URL, you'll see individual titles worked up by particular students. And all of the work there is, the work of students who are anywhere from second year undergraduates to graduate students. So the quality of the entry varies, but I will say it doesn't vary strictly according to how advanced the student is. One of the best entries is by a second year student. I recommend the entry on Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses. That was done by a second year undergrad at the University of Virginia. And there are other great entries done by undergrads in there as well. So it was a lot of fun. It's a great topic, and you wondered in your preliminary questions about what a literature department might have to say about best-selling fiction, but it's a great way to teach about bibliography. No one will take a course called bibliography, but they will take a course on 20th century American bestsellers. And yet, bestsellers are bibliographically hyperactive. They go through lots of editions. They have sequels and prequels and performances in other media, and they become lunch boxes and sleeping bags and all kinds of merch. So there's really no richer vein bibliographically, I think, than bestsellers, at least in contemporary mass-produced fiction. And they are also a great way to talk about audience. They're a great way to talk about taste and hierarchies of taste, and to talk about the publishing industry. John Sutherland has a great Oxford very short introduction to bestsellers from 2007, which we consulted on a little bit together. But there are great books on this topic. Thomas Whiteside in 1981 wrote The Blockbuster Complex, which is, I think, a definitive book about the vertical integration of the culture industry, how movies and publishing all became part of, Gulf oil, basically, and what the consequences of that were in terms of what was published and how it was marketed and consumed. And then there are great DH books on this. Jody Archer and Matt Jockers in 2016 published a book called The Bestsellers Code, which is an analytic approach to what makes a bestseller and how they work, and how that formula can be reproduced. So there is a ton of stuff to teach and talk about in bestsellers, and it also gives you a chance to look at books that are great and books that are really terrible. And I believe I'm probably the only person in my English department to have taught a Danielle Steele novel, but I think I'm better for it.
Well, I just wish that I'd had you teaching me when I did English. I suspect that the criteria for choosing books in my department was if they knew a book was a bestseller, they'd run a mile from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, let's move on to the role of the libraries. As you say, you're a relative latecomer to the library, but during your career, the role of libraries has transformed enormously. In that, what concerns libraries today tends to be deaccessioning print copies of books and journals. So, in an age where libraries are throwing out their print, what's the role of the library today, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure I accept the premise that libraries are throwing away their print. God knows that there are plenty of libraries that are building high-density storage facilities. I think Harvard probably builds one a year, in order to keep print collections. It's true that, a really good research library will have far too much print to have readily available on publicly accessible shelving in open library spaces. But that doesn't mean it's gone. I mean, we have only about half of our collection on open shelves, and the rest is in high density storage at UVA. And we are not a particularly large collection as American research libraries go. So there are plenty of libraries that have bigger collections and therefore more of them in storage, basically. So, but I think the role of the library in an age of digital publication is complex. It's you want to be sure that you are not losing the last copy of something that only exists in print, and there are plenty of those things. So I was involved, for example, when I was at Brandeis in establishing EAST, which is the Eastern Academic Scholars Trust. That was a consortium of institutions that agreed to survey their print collections and determine which books were rare among them, and then to make commitments to not deaccession those books without consulting with others. So you wouldn't accidentally deaccession the last copy of something. And so, that's one of the ways that libraries are trying to meet that mission while still dealing with the fact that there's way more being published every year than any of us can buy, even the Ivy League libraries don't buy it all anymore. So the other half of the complex task is figuring out how to acquire and preserve and make available electronic information, which is sadly a lot more complex and ephemeral than print. So, we for newspapers, for example, every library has probably 3 or 4 different sources for the same newspapers. And we have to figure out what's the best one to present, maybe even just for a particular date range of that newspaper. Some of them, are, the coverage is not complete in lots of places. It's a patchwork of different sources and vendors and forms, sometimes of the same material, that just it takes a real expert these days to figure out how to navigate electronic resources and electronic fulfillment services and all of that. So it's only made the job more complicated. It has not simplified librarianship.
Well, that leads us to the topic of collections and corpora, and this is something you've been involved in for many years. I see that right back in 1987, you helped set up the something called the Text Encoding Initiative. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, that's not quite true. In 1987, I was in grad school, but in 2000, I did incorporate the Text Encoding Initiative as a nonprofit membership organization, and I had gotten involved with them just a year or so before that. And my interest in the Text Encoding Initiative at that point was due to the job that I had as director of the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities at the University of Virginia. And we were in that institute producing lots of digital humanities projects that involved creating corpora of usually just a writer's texts, like the Rossetti Archive or the Blake Archive or the Whitman Archive or the Dickinson Archive. There were many things we called archives. I probably wouldn't call them that now, but that seemed like the right word at the time. And they had considerable effort expended on creating text bases. In fact, in the 90s, one of the first projects of almost any digital humanities undertaking was to create its digital library, because you couldn't just go out there and find it already digitized. So a lot of text production was done. It was very time-consuming. A lot of it was keyboarded by hand by graduate students in many cases. And so there was an interest in, making sure that this was done in a way that would survive changes in computer hardware and particularly software. And that was the purpose of the DEI. Initially, in 1987, it was created as an alternative to word processor formats, because people working on literary and linguistic texts realized that those were evanescent formats, and they did not want to lock up their labor in those formats. In fact, standard generalized markup language, the predecessor of XML, was created in response to a mandate from the Department of Defense, who wanted to make sure that their weapons manuals were in a non-proprietary format, so that they were not yoked to WordPerfect or some other piece of software. So, academic and non-academic uses of this kind of markup language often have the same motivation, which is to escape from proprietary formats. And for scholarship, which unfolds, in the humanities over decades in many cases, it's really quite important to have a software-neutral way of expressing what you want to say about the text and what you want to encode in the texts. So my initial interest was not in linguistic corpora as such, but just in finding a way to encode text that would not become obsolete in a couple of years. So if we had done it in Flash, in Macromedia, there were many choices, and many of them more attractive in immediate ways. But I was interested in standards because I knew that the scholarship that we were producing needed a longer horizon than we were going to get from proprietary software.
Sure, but quite apart from standards, the TEI seems, as I see it, to be sort of linked with this sort of dream, and we'll come back to this dream of trying to capture all books published, all books in English, up to a certain date, and that dream of a kind of a universal collection. And this led to, as you know, a mixture of there's some commercial and non-commercial collections. There's early English books online, for example. Can you tell us a bit about sort of what became of all those books encoded, captured by the TEI?
Well, EBO, Early English Books Online, is still out there. That was a creation of the Text Creation Partnership, TCP, which was a partnership between ProQuest or Chadwick Healy and Michigan, and then a little bit later, the Bodleian and Aberystwyth and a couple other places. UVA had a version of this kind of partnership as well around American fiction, where we did a lot of keyboarding. Graduate students keyboarded things in, and then the result was marketed by Chadwick Healy / ProQuest / Bell and Howell, whatever it was at the moment. And in fact, money came back into an account which was still being spent out when I arrived in 2016. I think we spent the last dollars out of that account in about 2019. So there was money that came back to libraries from that, and the partnership, I think, it was a good example of a commercial library partnership. It did produce a lot of texts in a way that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. It was all kind of overtaken in 2004 by Google Books and a much larger scale of that undertaking. But that work was done in a very different ways, So I think the impetus for TEI in corpora is longstanding. The ACL, the Association for Computational Linguistics, is one of the three organizations that originally sponsored the creation and maintenance of TEI. And it has been used for marking up language corpora. And we used it in some Mellon-funded text mining projects that I headed up in the 2010s when I was in Illinois. And those were things like Monk and Nora that were, large text bases that got normalized to a form of TEI for the purpose of linguistic analysis.
So the one question is, now the work of the TEI is essentially complete. Who owns this this corpus? Who owns it?
You're associating TEI and EBO too closely. Okay. The fact that EBO is complete does not mean that TEI is complete. TEI is an ongoing scholarly undertaking that I would, in general terms, describe as the longest running ontological exercise in the humanities. And I say that because the point of the TEI is to allow people to say, not to dictate, but to give people a grammar in which to express what they think they see in literary or linguistic text, and not only in English. The TEI has been translated into a number of languages, and it is deliberately multilingual as a standard, and has been for a very long time. So it's not only about English, it's not only about EBO, it is really about the larger project of a sort of systematic description and interchange of information about literary and linguistic texts And it's a membership organization, as I mentioned. Now it had its most recent membership meeting last September 2004-05 in Krakow in Poland. And every year, brings a community together of people who are using and developing this standard. And like any standard, you can't finish a standard. You have to maintain it because the world changes. And so the standard has to change in some ways to keep up. So TEI is still maintained very actively and has a active user community.
Your work on digital humanities, back in 2004 you edited a companion to digital humanities, so this was really quite pioneering at the time because there'd been very little work done in that area. Do you think that today, 20 years later, the humanities scholars have all engaged and understood what digital means?
Well, when you back up to the beginning of that question, there was a lot of work going back, some would say to the 60s, some would say to the 40s, some would say, I've claimed in some cases even earlier, that could be called digital humanities, that was called at the time humanities computing. And really, the shift that was introduced with that edited collection that you mentioned was a shift in nomenclature from humanities computing to digital humanities. And that was a deliberate effort to put the emphasis on humanities. In other words, in humanities computing, humanities is the modifier. In digital humanities, digital is the modifier. And humanities is the point. So that stuck and that caught on, but it was really just a rebranding of humanities computing as something maybe more focused on the humanities and a little less focused on computing, at least in the way it was named. And as to whether that's caught on, I certainly think a lot more humanities scholarship is using digital methods, which I would distinguish as being analytical methods, not say using a word processor. Not every tool is a method, so using analytical methods is more common, and I think probably at some point we will stop calling it digital humanities. But we haven't arrived at that point yet. It's still a meaningful distinction. And it's a distinction that arrives in every discipline at some point, but not at the same time across disciplines. I think it depends on when the primary source material of that particular discipline is rendered digital for the most part. So that happens at different times in different disciplines. So for astronomy, it was probably the Sloan Digital Sky Survey that marked the beginning of the digital turn in astronomy. I think for the humanities, it was 2004 and the Google Books project that marks that turn. If you think of the literary content of research libraries as being the core primary source material for humanities, that's when that was, if not entirely, certainly largely rendered digital. And in every discipline, when that happens, that prompts a turn to digital methods, usually as a way of simply grappling with or taking advantage of scale.
Absolutely, but one of the things you still notice at conferences is humanities scholars who claim that humanities is somehow different. It's humanities we don't work the same way as scientists do, and I'm never sure whether that's a genuine objection or it's simply a resistance to using digital methods.
Well, it's true that the research cultures are different. The stereotypes are fair to a certain extent. That the humanities scholar works in isolation, whereas science tends to be more collaborative. I think that's still largely true. But it's also true that there are a lot of projects in the humanities that are collaborative, and digital projects tend to encourage collaboration because you can throw so much in there, that no one person's expertise is going to cover everything that you could imagine including in your archive of whatever. So it encourages collaboration. It makes a place for graduate students that doesn't generally exist in more traditional humanities research. I mean, being a research assistant for your professor is not the same as being a collaborator. And one of the things that I think marks digital humanities is an interest in collaboration, including credited collaboration with students and with younger scholars. So, you can see that in projects like the Whitman Archive or the Valley of the Shadow, Ed Ayers' project. They have a long history of bringing graduate students along, making them co-authors, giving them credit for doing scholarship and not just scut work. And that's a thing that people prize about the digital humanities, and I think rightly so, because it can be pretty lonely and a little dismal, being a humanities graduate student in a non-collaborative environment, where you're just kind of, working for someone else and waiting for your turn.
You're absolutely right. I remember the monster and ongoing project to translate the French encyclopédie into English, which is being done by any number of people, and you can volunteer for it if you feel so inclined, and take on one of the I don't know how many thousands of entries. But let's move on to you mentioned already the Google Books initiative, and the Google Books initiative Google Books project seems to be a kind of a real kind of changing point in the whole sort of digitization sort of landscape. So where can we start? The Google Books project was begun sort of single-handedly by Google, and then ended in a huge lawsuit and or several lawsuits, and so I suppose my starting question is, do you think the Google Books initiative was actually attempting to do something that libraries should have been doing in any case?
Well, libraries were doing that in their own way. They were digitizing their own collections, and usually, using the kinds of methods that I've described, which include graduate students keyboarding texts by hand. And scanning, but mostly really just scanning images of things from their collections in the early days, at least. So that was work that was underway, which tells you that it was recognized as something that was important to do. But I don't think libraries were ever going to be capitalized to do it at the scale that Google did. So the intervention, was the intervention of capital. And, capital in this case was able to accomplish something in a matter of a few years with cooperation and in partnership with libraries. But it accomplished something that libraries, going as they were going, would not have accomplished in 100 years, I think. They were not on track to to achieve the level of digitization that Google Books did anytime soon. So clearly they knew it was important, and I think that's why they partnered with Google, because they realized that Google could do this faster. And they made arrangements which resulted in the Hathi Trust. So the libraries that contributed material got things back, and have copies of those to do important things for themselves. So, for example, during the pandemic, our library and many other libraries benefited from having copyrighted materials in the HathiTrust turned on for online access, as long as those items were actually in our physical collections, which were not at that time circulating, because we all thought fomite transmission was the vector for COVID. But that was a lifesaver. I mean, half of our collection, at least, was in Google Books. And so when all our students, were at home and nobody had access to the physical collection, libraries fell back on that, and it was an important resource, which, that wasn't done for us by Google. That was done for us by HathiTrust. And, so that's a good outcome.
Yeah. I'm sure you read Roger Sconfield's 2021 book called Along Came Google, and one of his conclusions was, rather than a universal digital library, we have a potpourri of digital collections with greater or lesser access. Do you think that's true?
Yeah. I mean, the Universal Library is a Voorhees story, and it's not a really practically realizable a dream. We will never achieve that, and so I don't think that's exactly a criticism. I think it is a statement of fact that we have a landscape of collections that vary from things that are pictures of pages with no OCR to things that are highly described and analyzed, and the kinds of things that we turned out from the Institute for Advanced Technology and Humanities. It's extremely careful work by experts, and everything in between. And the bulk of it is the kinds of stuff that we find in Google Books, which is searchable by OCR, hidden behind the page image. And that's a technique that's been around since early 2000s, and for most of what people want to do, that's enough. So people will do more, but I don't.
Do you not think national libraries, it strikes to me as one of the roles of the national libraries might be to try and to create a digital collection of the nation's resources?
Mm-hmm. And national libraries in countries other than the U.S. Have attempted that in some cases, and I think they have a better chance of seeing it actually happen than the United States. In many ways, we're too big. And the Library of Congress, being our national library, has done a lot over the last 20 years to render collections digital and to make things available to the public in digital form. But, everything's a tall order, even now. They can't really keep up with just those things that are submitted for copyright deposit. And that's not everything by a long shot. So I think there will always be selection. And even in those, national libraries that are small enough or well organized enough to, pull off a national collection, there's always selection at work, and things will, always be left out.
Sure. Perhaps the closest that we have in practical terms to a universal public library is the Internet Archive, and do you think the Internet Archive is the sort of is as good as it's going to get?
Well, it's in many ways it's as good as we've gotten, and I don't know beyond that, but I'm a big fan of the Internet Archive. I seriously doubted their ability to back up the web. When they started, I said, "You can't do that. That's not going to be possible." I was wrong. It's not the first time. Won't be the last time. But they have done an incredible job of preserving the web, and that as we see in this administration, is not a politically neutral thing. There are authoritarian regimes like the one we're under right now that really would like you not to have access to the past and not to have access to the record. And I think the Internet Archive is playing an important role there. They were also a wonderful partner in the 10 years that I worked on accessibility, print accessibility for people with print disabilities. So the last chapter of my research career was spent on that, and was mostly Mellon funded, a little from IMLS. But there's a lot of work to be done on not only figuring out how to make some aspects of print accessible, like charts and graphs and things that are not simply language, but also how to make things accessible for people with different kinds of print disabilities, and how to reduce the duplication of effort, which was really the focus of my work. And the Internet Archive has a print disabilities collection, which they give access to for people who have been qualified by one of a handful of authorities as having print disabilities. And they made that entire collection available through the platform that I was establishing. And they were just really, really good partners in that, through thick and thin. And, they're, especially about a year ago in October, when they were hacked to pieces, there were some really hard times there for them. And they still kept, plugging away at the accessibility stuff. It took it all offline for a while, but they brought it back, and I have a lot of admiration for them.
Well, the landscape today, clearly not everything can be perfect, because there are still new initiatives. And I noticed at the recent Charleston conference, there was a talk about the public interest corpus, which is another collection of pulling together, in this case, content that's typically within copyright. And I remember memorably Dave Hansen saying their goal when they set it up was, first and foremost, don't get sued. Is that the biggest problem in building a corpus?
I don't know. Sometimes I think your goal should be to get sued. Really, it's get it sued and get it over with. But aside from that, I think there's a lot to be said for having a publicly accessible corpus of copyrighted content. I mean, it is one of the ironies of my professional life that my interests are in late 20th century and 21st century literature, all of which is under copyright, none of which is therefore available readily for digital work. So I picked a method that was completely unsuited to my material. And that's where I've been ever since. But there's a precursor to this public interest collection in the Hathi Trust Research Center, which I worked with for at least 10 years, probably more. And one of the great accomplishments of that organization was to create a secure way of doing computational analysis on copyrighted material. And the importance of that is obvious, because if you just look at the print record and how much of it is in copyright and how much is out of copyright, the in copyright part is larger, and it will only get larger over time. So having a way to deal with that analytically is important. Little did we know that if we just had enough money, we could ignore copyright and simply hoover up everybody's stuff and steal it, and that would be fine, apparently. So I wish we'd known that. It would have simplified some things. But I will say clearly, the AI folks didn't embark on a mission of not getting sued. They embarked on a mission of, go ahead, sue us.
Yeah. Well, this is the situation today. If we fast forward to the present day, you could describe the explosion of Gen AI tools as a sort of as a frantic stop at nothing attempt to scan everything in existence, or to capture everything from wherever, regardless of copyright. So, if you were involved with an institution in a library today, what would your response be to this kind of this? They say it's it really is a sort of attack by bots, what's the best response?
It's a hugely serious problem right now for digital humanities projects and for libraries. Anybody who has a large amount of text that hangs out there on the open internet is experiencing what's essentially a denial of service attack now, and it makes these sites unusable for the actual human beings who want to use them. And the people who are unleashing these bots are, they are not nice in the technical term. They don't, throttle their requests in any way. They don't pay any attention to robots' instructions, robots.txt files, and they don't. And in fact, they programmatically shift their IP addresses so you can't block them by IP range. They're, really deliberately making it impossible to filter their traffic out. And that's just wrong. That's aside from any questions of rights, that's a denial of service to other people who are legitimate users of that content. And I think in some ways, libraries wouldn't care if that weren't going on. Libraries generally want people to use their stuff. Libraries militate for their own right to text mine when they license material from commercial vendors. They're not against, text mining. They're not far from it. They have, faculty and students more and more who, want to do data science on large, collections of stuff. And libraries think, well, we paid for it. They ought to be able to use it in that way if they want. And I think that's right. But it's it's this assault by bots that is completely unprincipled and unconstrained. That it's really unacceptable, and I don't know how we stop it. I think you can put CAPTCHA codes or something in front of everything, I guess, to make everything password protected. But that's really putting barriers in the way of people you want to find and use your stuff. It's putting barriers in the way of search engines that you would actually like to index your stuff, and all in order to prevent a kind of traffic, which is really, it doesn't need to be there, even to accomplish the goals that it's after. They could just, take 10 milliseconds more between requests, and it would be fine.
Yeah. And yet,
but it's really bad behavior.
Yeah, but one of the challenges of AI is that I'm told that I can believe that one of the reasons why the responses from Gen AI are often very poor is because there's so little control, so little validation and verification of the sources being used. So it stands to reason that institutions who are sitting on sort of large collections of heavily curated content could actually provide a much richer and more reliable, more, if you like, validated source of content for LLMs. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think that's what the Harvard project is about. To create a corpus of texts that are chosen deliberately, that are vetted for the quality of the reproduction of the text, that are assembled in a way that is meant to make them tractable to computation. That's a great response. It's going to probably be useful to academic researchers, who are really on the back foot here in terms of, their ability to keep up with things that are going on in the marketplace when the marketplace is driven by pirates, so I'm for that. but I don't think it will solve the piracy problem.
So looking back on your career of involvement with the digital humanities, do you think would you say you're optimistic or pessimistic with where we are today?
Um, that's a large question. There are so many factors impinging on universities right now, and what we're talking about is one little activity inside a range of universities, and those universities are really under assault in the U.S. in a way that I have not seen in my life before. And so it's hard to be optimistic about anything in universities right now. We're not seeing a lot of evidence of their ironclad commitment to their mission. We're seeing a lot of people cave. And so there's a great deal to be concerned about there. Within that world, I don't think that digital humanities is particularly at risk. I think it certainly, has social justice interests. It certainly has interests in DEI issues deeply embedded in DH. But I don't think it's, the first thing that the goons are going to come after, because it's just not very visible. It's the humanities, and they did not go, and got humanities funding as their, main move. Of course, they got it the NEH and they got it IMLS, and then you're done, But with science funding, it's so much more money, and it's more sources, but so much of it comes from the government. There's not there are private foundations like Sloan, with an interest in the sciences, but there's not the kind of private foundation counterbalance that there is in the humanities. Mellon is a huge funder of humanities research. It's on par with NEH, and there is no private funder out there in the sciences that I'm aware of that's on par with NSF or much less NIH. And gutting those things doesn't just threaten the science enterprise; it threatens the whole university, because of the way the universities have built that funding into their core operating expectations. So I think humanities are a bit off to the side here in terms of being a target. But I think we should strive to be more of a target, frankly. I think we should really be making as much noise as possible from a humanities point of view about what's going on and why it's wrong. And there are people doing that, and this is a time when historians like Timothy Snyder, for example, are really earning their keep. They're also moving out of the U.S. So, I think I would answer this question probably differently if I were in the UK or in France or in Germany. But in the US, there are dark times for the university right now, and humanities are part of that.
Well, as for you yourself, you're free of it. Now you're retired. Do you have a bucket list for your retirement?
No, I've tried to, resist giving myself any assignments, and also resisting letting other people do so. I've learned to bake a decent sourdough loaf, so I'll check that box. I'm spending more time learning Spanish so I can converse with my in-laws, and just eventually I hope to return to reading for pleasure, something which a PhD in English will beat out of you if you're not careful.
Oh gosh. Well, we'll swap notes. I'm on chapter 17 of my Learning Spanish book, so we'll see how much see how much
Well,
progress we're making.
If you do Duolingo, you will we can partner up there.
Yeah, sounds great. Anyway, thanks very much, John, for your time.
It's great. Thanks. Nice to talk to you.